probably noticed that over the last 3 or 4 days, Donald Trump has been saying that we need to have the military out this fall. For November, December, January, the military needs to be in the streets. Now, why would Donald Trump, of all people, be saying the military needs to be in the streets? I believe it's because he is planning to steal the election. And he knows that when he does, millions of Americans will pour out into the streets in protest, and he wants the military to put down those protests the same way that Pinochet did in 1973? No, I don't recall the year. Anyway, the same way Pinochet did, and and not just Pinochet, by the way. I mean, yeah, it was 73. Nate was right. And Putin does this. I mean, this is what dictators do. Shoot into the crowd, right? So how's he going to do this? What's his plan? Well, it's fairly straightforward. The 12th Amendment says unambiguously, and was not altered by the new Electoral Count Act. The 12th Amendment says that if none of the candidates hits the majority of the submitted votes for president, which, assuming every state's votes are actually submitted, would be 270 votes, Electoral College votes, then the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is right now controlled by Republicans, which raises a whole second issue, which, I kind of start my article today. By the way, today's article is over at HartmannReport.com. It's free. Anybody can read it. Then you can share it with your friends. It's titled, "Does Trump Have a 2024 Blueprint for Stealing the White House?" And what I point out is that Donald Trump is campaigning in California, Colorado, and New York. Now, why would he be doing that? Well, my buddy and colleague, Michelangelo Signorelli, whose show follows this program right here on Sirius XM channel 127, the Progress channel, I was on his show last Friday, which is what prompted me to write this piece, because he said that he had heard, or one of his callers had heard, I'm not sure exactly where he got it from, that a right-wing talk show host, he thought it was Mark Levin, but he wasn't 100% certain, that a right-wing talk show host had said that Trump is campaigning in blue states because there are some really tight House races in those states. It turns out there's about a dozen really tight House races in California, Colorado, and New York State. And Trump wants to be sure that Mike Johnson is still the Speaker of the House. Now, the House of Representatives gets sworn in on January 3rd. The President gets certified on January 6th. Now, if the Democrats take the House, Hakeem Jeffries becomes the leader of the House of Representatives, and it's unlikely that he would go along with a scheme to refuse to accept the certification of the election. But, the first and primary way that the election could be stolen is if Mike Johnson, keep in mind, Mike Johnson is the guy who organized the letter, wrote the letter, and went around and organized all of his colleagues to get 147 votes, not a majority, right? Not a majority of the House. It was certainly a majority of the Republicans, but it wasn't enough to vote in 2016. In January of 2021, to vote not to certify the election. Now, if he had been able to get every Republican to do that, it still would have been problematic because Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House at the time. But right now, Mike Johnson is Speaker of the House. And if he continues to be Speaker of the House, if he gets sworn in on January 3rd, then he could hold a vote on January 4th saying we're not going to, on January, leading up to January 6th, saying we refuse certification. We're not going to recognize the ballots from, say, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan because we think there was voter fraud. And they're telegraphing this to us right now. So let's play this out. Mike Johnson comes out and says, if he takes the House, if the Republicans take the House or hold the House, Mike Johnson comes out and says, you know, we're not going to vote to certify the president, and therefore there is no certification by the House. So what happens? Well, it gets thrown to the, you know, the Democrats would sue, and they would sue at the Supreme Court. And you've got 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court. Now, back in 2000, there was a 5 Republican majority on the Supreme Court. And, you know, something very similar happened. Down in Florida, the vote was in question. There was over 50,000 votes for Al Gore that Catherine Harris, Catherine Harris, excuse me, the Secretary of State, the Florida Secretary of State, she worked for Jeb Bush, who was the brother of George W. Bush. Catherine Harris said, you know, I'm just not going to count these 50,000 votes for Al Gore. These were votes of people who had both punched the Al Gore button or hole in the punch card and written Al Gore on the card. The intent of the voter was clear. And the Supreme Court ruled a long time ago that intent of the voter is the only thing that matters. But she said, oh, no, these are spoiled ballots. She invented this whole brand new category out of thin air. So, you know, kind of word was out that Catherine Harris had rigged the election. And I mean, this is in addition to having thrown 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls 3 months before the election. So, and all of that together was only able to get George Bush within, as I recall, 537 votes of the White House. So the Florida State Supreme Court said, you know, we're going to do a recount. And, of course, John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett went down to Florida to act as lawyers for the George W. Bush campaign. And you had the Brooks Brothers riot, where they were pounding on the windows, where they were counting the votes and demanding that the vote counting stop. And so that's one scenario. The House refuses to vote, and so it goes to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court says, well, obviously we've got a problem here. Let's just invoke the 12th Amendment, and that throws the election to the House of Representatives. Well, under the 12th Amendment, each state has 1 vote. So there's 50 votes for president. Right now there are 26 states that are controlled by Republicans. So you'd have a 26-24 vote in favor of Donald Trump. Donald Trump becomes president. That's, you know, strategy 1. Strategy 2, which we're also seeing played out right now among Republicans, is gum up the works in the states. If you can get 2 or 3 or 4 states that look like they went for Kamala Harris, where the local officials refuse to certify the results, or even state officials refuse to certify the results, or state officials can't certify the results because the local officials refuse to certify the votes, then what happens? Once again, you've got a constitutional crisis. And once again, it gets thrown to the U.S. Supreme Court, where once again, I believe 6 Republicans will say, well, let's just invoke the 12th Amendment and throw this to the House. I mean, the founders had a solution for this. In fact, you know, it was the House of Representatives that decided the election of 1800 that put Thomas Jefferson in the White House. This is nothing new. It was the House of Representatives that decided the election that put John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, in the White House. So, you know, this would not be the first time this has happened. And the Supreme Court loves precedent. So, as I said, I think this explains why Donald Trump is saying there's going to be riots in the streets. You know, part of it, I think, is that he knows that there are right-wingers where if it's clear that Kamala Harris won, they will be in the streets. But I don't think Donald Trump wants riot police in the streets to deal with Proud Boys. I think he wants riot police in the streets to deal with, you know, what in 4 years ago was the pussy hats, you know, the young women wearing pink hats with the cat ears on them.